When your own child looks you in the eye and says, "Find somewhere else to die, Mom. You're useless now," something inside you stops moving. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just packed my things, one folded blouse at a time, and left the home I'd built over 45 years. 3 days later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, discovering that my late husband had outsmarted our son long before he died. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Because this story, it's not about losing everything. It's about discovering how powerful you become once you do. My name is Margaret Dawson, 68 years old, retired nurse, widow, and mother of one. Until a few months ago, my world revolved around my husband, Henry, and our only child, Nathan. Henry was a quiet, meticulous man, an accountant who believed order was love. He handled every bill, every form, every future plan. And I handled everything else. Dinner on the table at 6, laundry folded by Sunday, and a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Then, without warning, Henry collapsed in his office one April morning. A heart attack. Quick. Final. The silence afterward was unbearable. Even the refrigerator hum sounded cruel. Nathan came home 2 days after the funeral, dressed in designer black, smelling of cologne and control. "Mum," he said softly, taking my hand, "you can't stay in that big house by yourself. It's too much for you." His wife Chelsea nodded, the kind of nod that looks caring but feels like strategy. "We found a lovely senior community, Mum. They have gardens, art classes, even yoga." I smiled politely. "I have a garden here, dear." Nathan's tone hardened just slightly. "But this house is too large. You'll be lonely here, lonely. I'd been lonely for years. I just hadn't realized it until Henry died." Weeks passed. Nathan's visits became frequent and shorter. Each one ended with a new suggestion to downsize. Then, one Sunday afternoon, he arrived without warning. Chelsea was with him, heels clicking like punctuation marks of authority. They stood in my doorway, framed by the sunlight, holding a manila envelope. "Mum," Nathan said briskly, "we need to talk about the house." I set down my tea, my pulse tightening. "What about it?" "According to Dad's will," he said, "everything passes to me. The house, the savings, the investments. You'll be taken care of course. But legally, it's all mine." My throat went dry. "That can't be right. Your father wouldn't—" Chelsea stepped forward. "It's all here, Mrs. Dawson." The attorney explained it. "You can stay here for a few weeks, but after that, it's best if we transition you somewhere safer." Safer. That word stabbed deeper than any insult could. Nathan sighed like a man exhausted by his mother's inconvenience. "Mum, please don't make this hard. You'll be comfortable, I promise. Comfortable." He said it like he was talking about euthanizing a dog. That night, while they packed their things in my kitchen, I walked upstairs to my room and stared at the empty spot on the dresser where Henry's photo used to sit. Chelsea had moved it, said it looked too depressing. I packed 2 suitcases, 45 years of life, reduced to luggage. Before I left, Nathan pressed a few $100s into my hand. "For now," he said, "until we set things up." Set things up. Translation: erase you quietly. I walked down the driveway without looking back. The porch light flicked off behind me before I reached the gate. 2 nights later, I sat in a roadside motel eating instant noodles from a paper cup. The room smelled like bleach and cigarette ash. Somewhere in the building, a television played an old sitcom laugh track. And then, out of nowhere, I remembered something. 5 years ago, Henry had shown me his will. I'd sat right beside him as he explained every clause. He'd been so careful, so proud of his foolproof planning. I remembered his words exactly. No matter what happens, you'll always have this house, Maggie. You built this life. I just balanced the books. He hadn't lied then, so who was lying now? The next morning, I took the 7 a.m. bus downtown to Langford and Associates, Henry's old law firm. I didn't call ahead. I didn't need an appointment. The receptionist looked startled when she saw me. Mrs. Dawson? We thought you'd moved to Florida. Florida? I said quietly. Who told you that? She hesitated. Your son. Moments later, Mr. Philip Langford, a dignified man with silver hair and kind eyes, walked out from his office. Margaret, he said warmly, I was wondering when you'd come in. I left messages at the house. Messages? He nodded. Yes, after the reading of Henry's will. Nathan said you were too distraught to attend, so he accepted everything on your behalf. My pulse pounded in my ears. Mr. Langford, I wasn't told about any reading. Nathan told me the estate was his Philip's face changed, concern giving way to something sharper. That's impossible. Your husband made very specific arrangements. He walked to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a folder. When he opened it, I saw Henry's signature at the bottom of the first page. I, Henry Dawson, being of sound mind and body, leave to my wife, Margaret Dawson, our residence at 110 Maple Hill Road, with all its contents, and 70% of my total assets, including accounts and investments, totaling approximately $14.8 million. He flipped the page. To my son, Nathan Dawson, I leave the remaining 30%, provided he treats his mother with dignity and care in the months following my death. My breath caught. I read the clause twice. Provided he treats his mother with dignity and care. Philip looked up. Henry was worried about Nathan's ambition. He added that clause last year. I leaned back, stunned. So if Nathan mistreated me, then his inheritance transfers to you entirely. Silence. Then quietly, Philip said, Mrs. Dawson, your son has already forfeited everything. When I left Philip Langford's office that day, I did not go back to the motel. I went straight to the bank. Not because I was suddenly greedy, but because I wanted the truth. And truth lives in paperwork, signatures, and ledgers. I walked into the polished marble lobby with the same small, steady steps I'd taken through this building for 40 years. The teller recognized me. The security guard tipped his head. People who live long in a place become part of the furniture, even if they've been pushed off a chair. I asked to see the accounts tied to my husband's name. Within an hour, a manager sat across from me with a neat stack of printouts, numbers, dates, transfers, the mathematics of the life Henry had built. Mrs. Dawson? He began. For now, we've put a hold on the major withdrawals, pending notification from the attorney and law enforcement if necessary. He spoke the careful language of banking officials, the kind that makes you feel like an actor in someone else's drama. Until the dispute is resolved, no one can access these funds. Relief is a quiet thing. It isn't fireworks or triumphant orchestras. It is a breath you didn't know you were holding until you finally let it out. I let mine out there, in that window-lit office, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of equilibrium. That afternoon, Philip and I began what he called Operation Restore. He was methodical. Letters drafted, affidavits sworn, a police report filed by an officer who didn't condescend when he looked at me and asked, "Do you want to press charges?" I did. I wanted accountability. I wanted the law to say aloud what my heart already knew. Nathan had crossed a line. Nathan's arrest was neither theatrical nor private. The police wanted to avoid a public scene, so they waited until he was at the office, his sanctuary of meetings and polished deals, and executed the warrant there. I stayed home while men came and went with boxes and folders. Chelsea's car sat in the driveway with a half-drunk latte in a cup holder and a scarf hanging from the passenger seat. There were flowers in a vase that had never been arranged by my hands. It felt obscene. The charges read like a crime novel: forgery, fraud, elder abuse, and attempted transfer of assets by falsified documents. The court filings were clear. Nathan had presented an altered copy of Henry's will to the attorney, claiming it as final. His signature, carefully traced, matched Henry's in the places the falsified text required. The forger had been clumsy in places. The paper came from an office supply store that sold to Nathan's firm, and the ink could be traced to his printer. It was, in the end, a sloppy arrogance. He had believed his confidence would be the only evidence anyone needed. When they arrested him, Nathan looked at me through the maelstrom with something that was almost recognition, not of the deed he'd done, but of the person I'd become. His eyes had the dull panic of a man whose map of the world had suddenly shown him a border he didn't expect to cross. Courtrooms make people small. They reduce the most confident to witness boxes and procedural steps. In that courtroom, Nathan's swagger dissolved into legalese and counsel. He called me in the early days, begging, pleading, alternating between anger and a practiced sorrow. "Mom, you don't understand." I had to do what I did. The business needs liquidity. Dad would have wanted this structured differently. He sounded like every justification I had ever heard when people refused to own their actions. But it wasn't only about the courts or the bank holds. It was the way people looked at me afterward, some with pity, some with a new respect. Strangers came to my door. A neighbor I'd once baked bread for, a woman from the church group, a reporter who wanted to know gently whether I'd consider speaking publicly. I said no, because I was not ready to be a headline. Yet. Meanwhile, the legal tide I expected to carry me toward a quiet recovery started to reveal undercurrents I hadn't seen. Philip called me 3 days after Nathan's arrest and asked me to come to his office alone. His face was grave in that way seasoned men have when they carry news that requires care. "Margaret," he said, "there's something you need to know about Henry's business affairs." I felt the floor tilt. Secrets never show up on neat little envelopes. They arrive like storms. Philip explained that during the estate review, the standard due diligence that comes with large estates, anomalies had surfaced. There were accounts that did not appear on any personal ledger, transfers routed through consultants and shell companies. At first, he suggested, the books looked like a man with varied investments: art, land, trusts. Then one of the accountants drew a line and said, "This doesn't add up." Those were the words that make lawyers sit up straight. We convened quietly. Philip, an unflappable man, brought in Carol Reyes, a forensic accountant he often worked with. Carol looked like someone who had spent her life finding truth in numbers. She set up a laptop and the files, and the analysis began. What we found was not simple. It was layered. There were transactions that looked innocent. Payments to a company called North Point Consulting, consulting fees, fees for compliance services. But when Carol traced North Point, it was a shell. No employees, a postbox address, payments that cycled money through other entities and back to accounts linked to individuals who had been named in a series of local wild money deals a decade ago. Small sums became larger sums, then evaporated into accounts outside the country. It was, Carol said quietly, a pattern consistent with money movement that wants to avoid attention. I listened as she described a web that had used legitimate businesses to move funds. The language she used was clinical: laundering, front companies, retainers. But the implication struck like a physical blow. Henry wasn't just an accountant, she said. He was cleaning books. These transfers match behavior connected to organized operations. The room blurred. Henry, whom I had walked beside for 45 years, who had kissed me before dawn and read finance columns for fun, was suddenly a stranger who had lived a double life. I could have walked away. Many people would. Some marriages are built to compartmentalize. You close a cupboard and never question what is folded inside. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The same son who'd tried to steal from me had used those same hidden channels to attempt to launder confusion into access. If Henry's books were dirty, those accounts we had thought secure might not be. That night, I lay awake, thinking of the kind of people who thrive in shadows. Money moved like a river, carrying unnoticed things downstream. I thought of Nathan and Chelsea, of the way they had moved through my house like invaders who'd never learned the map of its rooms. I thought of Henry, whether he had been willing or coerced, whether this had been a conscious moral failing or a complex tangle of debt and danger. The more I thought, the clearer something became. I could reclaim my home by legal means, but the money might not be mine to keep if the authorities found a criminal line running through it. The next morning, I drove to the U.S. Attorney's office. You do not walk into that kind of place unless you are prepared to have your life rearranged. I sat with a woman named Special Agent Lillian Hart, a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes. She listened with a patience that had no pity and no flinch. When I finished, she took my documents, Henry's ledgers, Carol's preliminary report, the notarized will, and placed them in a manila folder. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, "if Henry's funds were involved in criminal activity, the government will investigate. We will determine which assets are proceeds of crime and which are legitimate. You may be entitled to a portion or compelled to assist in the investigation." That was the first time the word seized entered my vocabulary with a judicial seriousness. Seized, not frozen. Seized. It was also the first time I felt a strange, stubborn clarity. I had been pushed out of my home by my own son. I had been made small. Now I had a choice: walk away silently and let unknown forces decide my future, or step into a legal process that might paint the rest of my life with uncertainty, but could also unmask the truth. I chose the truth, not because it would spare me discomfort, but because the alternative was cowardice. The investigation that followed was not cinematic. It was paperwork and subpoenas and phone calls that made you repeat your name a half-dozen times, and days that blurred into weeks. Agents came to the house, to the office, and to the bank. They asked about transactions I didn't understand. They asked about meetings Henry had attended. I pieced together what I could. Receipts tucked into a drawer for consulting retainer, envelopes with foreign stamps, notes in Henry's neat hand about long-term cooperation. In a twist that felt like something pulled from the back half of a biography, the agents delivered a revelation that would redraw everything. Henry had been cooperating with federal authorities, quietly, in secret. For years, he had fed information to a task force working to dismantle a trafficking of funds through regional businesses. His role had been dangerous and deceptive by necessity. To maintain cover, he had to allow certain transactions to occur, and the agents had permitted him to take compensatory payments that were routed through accounts to maintain his cover. Those payments, however, now looked suspect to any outside auditor. I remember the exact way Agent Hart said his name. Henry was an informant. The sentence made the air in the room crack with sound. The possibility shifted the problem from a simple tale of cowardice and greed to a skein of moral complexity. Henry had not merely been taking money for himself. He had been playing a role in a larger law enforcement strategy that had kept dangerous people under surveillance, allowing the feds to gather enough evidence to prosecute. The accounts were messy because they had to be. Was he forced? I asked. It was not a question of legality. It was a question of betrayal. Was he doing this willingly? Agent Hart looked at me with a firmness I would come to trust. From what we have so far, Henry was working with us. He volunteered information and assisted in complex operations. It's possible he took funds as part of maintaining cover, which, while authorized by investigators, complicates property claims in estate law. Complicates was a gentle word for a jagged reality. The irony was almost cruel. Nathan had tried to engineer a theft using forged documents, relying on his assumptions about the simplicity of my life and the vulnerability he believed I posed. In trying to cheat me out of an inheritance, he had triggered a chain reaction that exposed his father's covert work. The federal case meant that some assets, the ones tied to the undercover operations, could be seized for evidence or forfeited. But it also meant that Henry's cooperation might explain transfers that otherwise looked criminal. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: agency. Here I was, standing at the confluence of family betrayal and federal investigations, with the power to shape what came next. The law was not always about right and wrong in tidy boxes. It was about truth. And truth, even when complicated, can free you. We negotiated carefully through Philip and Agent Hart. The U.S. Attorney's Office would assess which funds were clearly proceeds of criminal activity and which were tied to Henry's operative role. Funds that could be documented as legitimately obtained for the household would remain part of the estate. Assets connected to undercover payments would either be seized as evidence or returned as determined by prosecutorial review. The process took months. Meanwhile, Nathan sat in an interrogation room telling half-truths, and Chelsea's lawyer spun alternative narratives that blamed my absence for Henry's choices. The tabloids tried to paint it as a morality play. The truth was messier. There were nights when I doubted myself. Where had I been while Henry kept these layers from me? Had I been naive? Or had Henry been protecting me with silence? There was no simple answer. The only thing that felt clear was this: Nathan had tried to reduce my life to a paragraph in his ledger, and in doing so, he had revealed the fragile arrogance at the heart of his success. People who construct their lives on the assumption that rules apply only to others tend not to survive scrutiny. When the dust settled, the court found Nathan guilty of forging documents and attempting to defraud the estate. He was sentenced to prison time and restitution. Chelsea chose separation. Some alliances are as transactional as the money they orbit. For Henry's part, the federal inquiry confirmed his role as a cooperating source. The authorities praised his contributions that led to several prosecutions. Some of the assets associated with undercover work were kept by the government as part of ongoing cases, but much of the estate, including the house and a significant portion of the accounts, was legally mine. The victory tasted like ash and iron and something else. The solemn satisfaction of justice served, but not necessarily justice as a sweet dessert. It was justice as a tool for balance. With the legal side tending to finality, another kind of work began. I could have retreated with money and security and closed the door on the chaos. Many suggested I take a trip, move to Florida, find a quieter life. But walking away felt like letting them define the ending. If Henry's secret life had cost the community safety, If Nathan's greed had almost erased my life's work, then perhaps my role now was to make sure no one else suffered like this. I began to meet with women in the community who had quietly suffered financial manipulations by relatives. I listened to stories of grandchildren being pawned off, of signatures falsified on municipal documents, of wills that had been altered in the night. Each story was a mirror to mine. Each one whispered the same warning. Elders are vulnerable when their families see inheritance, not legacy. I decided to use part of the estate to create a small legal clinic, not a grand foundation with parlour rooms and photo ops, but a practical office with a desk and a paralegal and a lawyer who would consult pro bono for seniors facing financial manipulation. It would be modest, yes, but it would be real, and it would be sustained by funds that had been threatened by greed. The day we opened the doors to the Maple Hill Elder Rights Centre, I felt the weight of the past and the lightness of a new purpose. I walked through the small waiting room where a woman sat nervously holding a stack of documents. I offered tea and a chair and listened while she told me about a son who'd been helpful until he wasn't. She left with a pamphlet and an appointment, and the sense that she had been seen. When the first board meeting convened, Philip sat across from me and said something I will never forget. "You did not just get your life back," he said quietly. "You changed its terms." Those words felt true in my bones. I had been pushed to leave and forced to return. In the space between, I had learned to make choices I hadn't known I could. But even as the clinic began to provide relief to others, there were nights when the house felt too quiet. I would stand in the kitchen where Henry had once made coffee at dawn and remember the man who had compartmentalized his life into ledgers and lies. I would think of Nathan, in his cell, thinking about the ledger he had tried so desperately to rewrite. And sometimes, when the sun hit the windows just right, I would take a painting into the studio I had reclaimed, the study that had been Henry's domain, and I would paint, slowly, deliberately, scenes of light in new rooms. The colours amused me. They felt like protest and forgiveness in equal measure. It had been 7 months since I walked out of my son's house with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. Now I was standing in the same driveway, not as a guest, not as a mother pleading to be understood, but as the legal owner of everything they thought they'd stolen. Nathan's trial was over. He had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison with eligibility for early release if he cooperated with the financial investigation. Chelsea had divorced him within a month of the verdict. Some bonds dissolve faster than ink on a signature. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe because I wasn't looking at it through fear anymore. I opened the front door, and the air smelled of dust and old perfume. Their furniture was gone, but the walls still remembered their noise. Laughter that wasn't real. Conversations built on calculation. I stood there for a long time, until the silence felt clean again. That evening, I opened Henry's old study, the room that had once been off limits to me. It was bare except for a few boxes of files and a safe in the corner. The agents had left it sealed. They said anything inside wasn't part of the investigation. I turned the combination lock the way I'd seen Henry do 100 times. It opened on the 3rd try. Inside was a single envelope, thick and neatly labelled in Henry's handwriting. For Margaret. "If the truth ever finds you." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were 2 things: a handwritten letter and a flash drive. The letter began, "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the world I kept hidden has found its way to your doorstep. I never wanted you to carry my burdens. For 12 years, I worked with the Department of Justice to uncover a network laundering money through small businesses, the same world I once helped build. I agreed to cooperate because I couldn't live with the weight of it anymore. If they come to you, tell them the truth. I left nothing dirty in your name. Everything tied to you is clean and earned. And Maggie, I know Nathan isn't the man we hoped he'd become, but maybe one day he'll understand that greed was the worst inheritance of all. I sat there, reading the letter again and again, until the words blurred into light. For the first time, I didn't feel betrayed by Henry's secrets. I felt seen. He hadn't been hiding from me. He'd been protecting me, in his own flawed, silent way. The flash drive contained video recordings. Henry talking to investigators, explaining ledgers, sharing names. He looked older, tired, but clear. It was evidence of a man trying to right decades of wrongs. When I finished watching, I whispered into the empty room, "You did what you could. And now, I'll do the same." The Maple Hill Elder Rights Center grew faster than anyone expected. We started with one lawyer and a secretary. Within 6 months, we had 4 attorneys, a volunteer hotline, and a waiting list of seniors who needed help. I used part of Henry's clean estate to fund a grant for women rebuilding their lives after financial betrayal. Wives, mothers, widows who'd been erased from their own homes. Every time I saw one of them smile when they got their house back, or cry when a court ruled in their favor, I saw pieces of myself returning too. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in almost a year. Nathan. I didn't answer. But an hour later, a letter arrived by courier. Prison stationery. The handwriting was careful, smaller than I remembered, like he was trying to make himself fit back into my life. "Mum, I know I can't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I think about that night every day, watching you pack your bags while I stood there like a stranger. I don't know why I said what I said. Maybe because deep down, I hated seeing how much I'd become like Dad. Hiding, pretending, controlling. I understand now that I didn't lose your money. I lost your trust. And that's worth more than anything I ever tried to steal. I just hope one day you'll let me prove that I've changed." I folded the letter neatly and put it in the same safe where Henry's had been. Because some words are meant to rest, not answer. A year passed, then 2. Nathan was released early for good behavior. He called once, left a message. "Mum, I'm starting over. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." I never called back. Forgiveness is a door, but not every door needs reopening. One autumn evening, I was invited to speak at a local university about financial resilience and elder protection. The auditorium was full. Students, journalists, community workers. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that might one day grow old, and said, "People think aging makes you invisible, that your worth fades when your usefulness does. But I stand here as proof that life doesn't end when people decide you've outlived your purpose. Sometimes that's exactly when it begins." The applause that followed wasn't for me alone. It was for every mother who'd been dismissed, every widow who'd been written off, every elder who'd been told they were in the way. That night, as I drove home, the sky was violet and heavy with stars. I stopped by the lake behind my house, the same lake I used to stare at when grief first hollowed me out. The water was still, the moon floating on it like a promise kept. I whispered into the night, "Henry, we made it right." Then I added quietly, "And Nathan, I hope someday you learn what that really means." Inside, the house felt alive again. Warm lights, soft music, the smell of fresh paint and coffee. In Henry's old study, now my art room, a canvas waited. I picked up a brush and began to paint. A woman standing at a window, sunlight spilling across her face. No wedding ring, No shadow behind her, just strength. Quiet, steady, undeniable. When the painting was done, I signed it in the corner. M.D. Margaret Dawson. Not Mrs. Henry Dawson. Not Mom. Just me. If you've watched this far, thank you. And if someone ever tells you that you're too old, too weak, or too late to start over, remember my story. Because the best revenge isn't destroying those who wronged you. It's rebuilding so powerfully that their memory no longer defines you. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, if life took everything from you tomorrow, what part of yourself would you fight to rebuild first?